Bergen Kunsthall's lecture series. Today's platform takes place in connection with the exhibition "Oh Superman, Two Girls, Tricky, I'm Here Where You" on vocal performance, which has been on display in the Kunsthall since the end of August. It is a group show curated by Mark Beasley and including works by Laurie Anderson, Black Quantum Futurism, Lizzie Bugatzos, Jem Cohen, Attila, Jan McKay, Steve McQueen and Tricky, More Modest, Stephen O'Malley, Tony Auschler, Mike Kelly and Nicholas Bullen. We are very happy today to have Nicholas Bullen back to Bergen with the lecture Into the Black Hole. And Nicholas is an artist and composer based in Birmingham in England, and using material that has personal associations, Nicholas explores the transmutations of elements and their relationships to psychological perception and space. His work is interdisciplinary in approach and is developed across a range of media, including sound, installation, film, performance, and text. Nicholas is perhaps best known in Norway as a singer and bassist and a founder of the band Napalm Death, who created the Grindcore genre in the mid-80s. And so Nicholas is here today with Into the Black Hole lecture. Please welcome him.
Hello. Yes, I'm Nicholas Bullen, an artist, composer, and musician. I frequently use the human voice as material for my work, not only in my compositions, in installations, and in fixed media works, but particularly in performance, in a mode that's explicitly physical, using my body as the site for the performance, and which occurs in time and space, and often in a public context. I approach the voice from a position that looks towards its potential for expression and exploration in terms of abrasion, representation, transformation, and potentially subversion. So I'd like to quickly begin with some short examples that I've excerpted from some of my live performance works. I believe in the depth of their emotions and the triumph of their handkerchiefs. I believe in Tokyo, Benidorm, the Turbis Slope, Wake Island, some slippery pavement, Dealey Plaza. I believe in the thorn accident, venereal disease, fever and exhaustion. I believe in pain. I believe in a dead heat. I believe in all three objects usually shaping ads. I believe in maps, diagrams, codes, chess games, puzzles, airline timetables, device between superdanium. I believe all relatively reasonable. I believe all reasons. I believe hallucinations. I believe all shop windows. I believe all mythologies, memories, lies, fantasies, illusions. I believe in the mystery and melancholy of the machine itself, in the kindness of trees, in another story.
we're seeing the most severe contraction of credit for decades. Britain's boom, for example, was part-financed by more than £700 billion of foreign money. Now, in the £B-ST, that money has disappeared. Billions have been £-ST of the British economy, and the cogs of commerce are grinding to a halt. The impact on the real economy is devastating. Whether it's the most efficient cart plant in £E rope, or the store at the end of the street, they're all £s for saving. They're all starved of credit. The policy priority is clear. We've got to get credit moving again. So when it comes to monetary policy, yes, I do believe the old £, less SHO LD torn P radical monetary activism is what the economy needs. We've got to take all the necessary steps to restore confidence in our banking system and get credit flowing again. That's why my party supported recapitalization of British banks. It's why we proposed a national loan G around a scheme to and like bank lending to P sinus. It's why we as support the principle of INS rate banks losses for a fee, THO GH the devil is in the details. And it's why, as a last resort, we might have to consider P quantitative easing too. BECA pounds are exceptional monetary problems demand exceptional monetary SOL terms. So if it's right to discard the old orthodoxy on monetary policy, SHO LP, we also abandon the old orthodoxy on fiscal policy. SHO LP, we give B the idea of fiscal responsibility, and S spend all the old less savio we borrow in and deficit S we have ARC £70, RECSSR and VSX solely.
So I intend to use this lecture to present an autobiographical overview of how my own approach to the voice has developed through my life, and to touch upon the potential for the voice beyond its formal qualities, particularly looking at ways in which the voice can be used in a confrontational manner to interrogate and attempt to silence language itself. Finding my voice, childhood encounters. As children, we become aware that the voice possesses a certain power. When we move beyond the pre-language period, we learn that the voice is a privileged mechanism for communication. The voice communicates to us and allows us to communicate. We also become aware that the voice can dictate our actions. For example, the instructions of our peers or parents. And that in this mode, it surrounds and envelops us. We understand that the voice carries weight. For myself, this awareness of the inherent power of the voice led to an intuitive attraction to those moments where the voice fragments and becomes strange, where it seems to mutate and become something other. Examples of this alteration, this mutation, were happened upon by chance. They appeared in the detritus and rubbish of popular culture. Examples might be Casey Jr. the Train in the Disney film Dumbo, novelty records like Sparky's Magic Piano and the Big Boppers, The Purple People Eater Meets the Witch Doctor, in the English fantasy children's television of the 1970s, such as Doctor Who, and in genre cinema, the robots of science fiction, such as the Alpha 60 computer in Jean-Luc Godard's Alphaville. And I shall play a couple of examples of those elements.
You belong to us. You shall be like us.
Ladies the sweetest music of the side of Mars. They win a
Who's that? Who's calling me? It is I, your piano.
You know our ways. This is our planet. My people ruled the earth when man was only an ape. We shall destroy man and reclaim the planet.
Why have you released the apes? I have decided that it is possible for the two species to live together on this planet. This planet is ours! This other species has developed its own civilization. We must accept them as equals. I disagree! We must destroy them!
I am now in total automation. Your every wish is my command. Oh, Mom and Dad.
Il arrive que la réalité soit trop complexe pour la transmission orale. La légende la recrée sous une forme.
So these voices presented a rupture, not only in representation, as they often gave voice to machinery or alien life forms, but in reality itself, they representing moments where the fabric of the everyday starts to separate. And for me, they simultaneously unnerved me and also fascinated me. Post-punk, the body in the 1970s. I'd become interested to the point of obsession with punk music from the age of 10 years old in 1978. And I quickly and naturally gravitated towards its more extreme manifestations and into the post-punk music that was available at the time. The music created as part of the post-punk era of the late 1970s maintained an awareness of and a degree of interaction with the increasing interest in the body that had developed across a range of spheres during that decade, including political theory, particularly feminism, philosophy, such as the renewed interest in the writings of Georges Bataille, and in terms of artistic practice, that is, the body as the site of and material for art in the work of artists such as Gina Panay and Anna Mendiata. Post-punk music often contained a strong focus on the voice as an object which emanates from the physical, from the body, and is transformed in the process. In doing so, it undermined the voice's traditional status in popular music as a carrier of meaning, and instead focused on its potential as material for the generation of sound and for the amplification of content. At its furthest extremes, the voice in post-punk became a transformed object that mirrored the often transgressive focus of the artists themselves. Examples would include the distortion of the voice through analog electronic processing on recordings by industrial groups such as Cabaret Voltaire and Throbbing Gristle, the feral gesticulations and glossolalia of recordings by Diamanda Galas and Arto Lindsay, and the dismemberment of the voice through electronic collage and cut-up in the work of artists such as Nurse with Wound. And I'd like to play a few examples of those uses of the voice now.
Mechanical man. I'm a mechanical man. 2 mechanical arms. 2 mechanical legs.
Long wind carrying him down, pink shooting, spindling up her ear, like a southern crowd head the back. All the night wearing for the big bulk of her heart was the tin iron of it was. It's past bordered by stone, turned black stone.
Or 20. Hold on, around. Look at it. Yes, look it out. Look at it.
Hardcore punk to crack your brain up. As punk music became more insular in the 1980s, it began to exist in a more underground space outside of the dominant social culture around it. It became, by its own terminology, hardcore. My youthful immersion in what has been retrospectively termed cassette culture, that is, a do-it-yourself approach to music and sound where people would share and trade music on cassette tapes through the postal service, often for no cost, allowed me to access sounds from across the globe. And they included a small number of musical groups within the hardcore punk genre who utilised a particularly abrasive vocal style where their vocal delivery became much more raw and atonal. These somewhat obscure groups included United Mutation from America, Ratus and Shitlickers from Finland, and in particular a number of groups from Japan, such as Gaia, Kuro, Confuse and Jism, alongside certain groups from the fringes of the heavy metal genre, including Sodom, Possessed and Hellhammer. The interplay between form and content within the most hardcore genres of punk music and others developed as an interest in, an inclination towards notions of extremity, including isolated examples of this development of a vocal style which aimed for a more extreme form of expression, And this resulted in a vocalization that was lower in key, deeper in tone, and more guttural in its physical manifestation from the body. I shall play a couple of short examples. So this vocal style emphasised the expression of the voice through the body, centering on the diaphragm and the stomach. In contrast to the focus on hard glottal sounds, for example, the percussive in the voice-based explorations of Dada poetry, the futurists Parole in Liberta, and the sound poetry of Henri Chopin, Bob Cobbing, and Lily Greenham, this voice is a growl, an animal expulsion extending from deep within the body cavity. It's a physical sound. The tonal quality of the voice itself is abraded by its expulsion, so that beyond its stylistic overtones, it becomes an abstracted expression of the materiality of the physical body. These focuses on concepts of extremity and an approach to the voice which prioritized its physical manifestation through performance informed my own vocal explorations in the group I formed in 1981, Napalm Death. From hardcore to grindcore. The anti-music created by Napalm Death in the mid-1980s, documented on the group's debut album Scum in 1986, developed out of this conflation of musical subgenres which focus on notions of extremity, and it ultimately resolved itself into the creation of a new subgenre known as grindcore. Grindcore could be most simply described as an amalgam of a number of key constituent elements: minimalist song structures, fast tempos, including the use of the blast beat, a minimal drum pattern played at high tempos, use of distortion on both lead and bass guitars, the retuning of instruments to lower pitches, and the voice transformed into a low-pitched form of growling, retrospectively known by various names, including the Cookie Monster vocals, where the coherence of the lyrical content is overshadowed by the form which the voice takes. I can play a short example of this now. Just as the physical presence of sound waves affects the body, the expression of a voice may be influenced by the surrounding activity within which it operates, so that formal considerations impact upon the physical sound and delivery mechanism of the voice. In Napalm Death, as I've said, the tuning of the instruments was repositioned. We down-tuned the pitch of the guitars to a lower pitch than the concert pitch that's traditionally utilised in the orthodox practice of music in Western cultures. In terms of sonic events, that down-tuning creates a deeper and bass-orientated sound, and the voice simultaneously dropped in pitch following that process, becoming more guttural, coming from the lower reaches of the stomach and the diaphragm. Grindcore has an urge towards a heightened velocity, and the kinetic energy of that desire begins a compaction of temporal elements. That is, song lengths become shorter, and their internal structures become compressed. This compaction of temporal space acts upon all the elements within it. One of its immediate results is a further mutation in the voice. As duration is reduced, the voice must contract to accommodate the reduced space. Results in the delivery of lyrical content in short, sharp bursts. The voice blurs. Vowels and consonants are forced into a tighter temporal space. These elements also contributed to an approach to composition that rejected the traditional models. Composition was no longer focused on point to counterpoint. Rather than presenting a forward movement towards resolution, this music pushed towards a freer compositional space that privileged sound narrative over narrative sequence. In this, the song becomes a laminar stream of sound, an express train that is rushing towards oblivion. In the same manner that John Hilliard's camera recording Its Own Condition, 1971, moves the image from the clarity of light to abject darkness, this music enters into a black hole. The voice becomes almost unrecognizable. It moves beyond its status as a site of communication and meaning to becoming an object. And it's an object which seems to attempt to erase its own subject. This voice seeks a mode of communication which operates precisely through its own loss of expressive capability. It simultaneously alienates itself from expression and expresses alienation. It becomes an expression of language against language. In this process, the garbling of the larynx becomes an oral blast. It's denuded of its overt traditional meaning and reduces the function of the vocal chain to one of pure utterance into the realm of sound. As I said at the beginning, this voice has become one source of material in my work, a very, very central source of material. But this voice serves another function beyond its formal qualities. It functions as a vehicle for the interrogation of language and the exploration of strategies that seek to undermine the power of language and the voice itself. The voice and language. When we speak of the voice, in reality, we are often speaking of language. Language underpins the voice. The status which language has retained within Western culture demonstrates its importance. Since the primal word that begins many religious texts, language has continued to retain a central and privileged position due to its functions. In particular, its organisational function as a primary means of conveying and defining meaning. The work of Ludwig Wittgenstein and Jacques Lacan has illuminated how the foundation of language is located within the social context, within the social form of life. The social pact, that is, the construction of language within the social realm, continues to define the practice of language as a stabilising agent within a social network, an agent which facilitates communication within the social realm between separate individuals and the group, and consequently facilitates the effective functioning of the surrounding society. In a textual culture, the voice occupies the position of primary communicator. It is the facilitator for creating meaning, operating as a form of social adhesive by creating cohesion through a communication structure which conjoins individuals into a whole. However, beyond this surface function as a means of communication, language may, and does, take on other tasks. In the logocentric cultures of Western Europe, language not only operates as a tool for communication, but as a means of the construction of social reality, that is, the way we live. Language measures and it discriminates. And in doing so, it also separates and oppresses. It can be used to impose social identity upon the individual's body, both in terms of content. If we think of the importance of naming, from naming ceremonies in indigenous cultures and the renaming actions of conquerors, to the renaming which cyclically occurs in marketing, in business and politics. And also in terms of form, certainly within it, in England, the voice is probably the last true signifier of a person's place within the class structure. For example, my own home city has a particular accent that is regularly described as and voted for as the most stupid accent in England. That in itself is a form of social oppression. So, observed in this manner, language takes on a darker hue. Jacques Derrida noted that presence, the act of thinking or reading, is defined within linguistic parameters, and in this sense defines the channels of communication for all individuals. Despite the prevalence of visual communication signals such as body language, language only allows understanding of these movements through itself, that is, through the ordering medium of language. Through this selective and hierarchical process, language assumes a dominant position from which it can impose restrictions upon thought. So cultures which validate concepts through this mesh of language, through phenome and syntax, and assign language the value of repository of meaning, implicitly fear the breakdown of this system of communication, particularly a breakdown at its most primal level, the voice. The dissolution of language represents a destruction of meaning, which threatens to engulf and obliterate. When expression moves beyond the recognized boundaries and sanctioned modes of discourse, the wordless voice becomes a representation of delirium, of loss of control, and ultimately of the loss of humanity. Here the voice is assigned the status of pariah. So consequently, the expression of a voice beyond those limits has been consistently devalued. If we think of the negative associations given to certain voices in the context of the body, the feminine, the emotions. In its ephemerality and uncertainty, this beyond the limits voice represents a threat to the dominance of language itself. It cannot be tied down, it cannot be delineated, it cannot be inscribed or measured. It disrupts the exchange of meaning through a radical disjuncture in the mode of delivery, that is, the mutation of the voice. So if language is indeed a key element in a complex structure, it would seem inevitable that any position of opposition to this structure would engage with language. The symbolist poets of the late 19th century in France acknowledged that defiance of a society must also include a defiance of its structures of language. Symbolism utilized a radical rending of language as a means of acknowledging and achieving this end, simultaneously developing an exploration of and focus upon the oral properties of language as a sound event. And this early illumination, the recognition of language as a site of conflict, has informed much of the transgressive art of the 20th century and beyond. In the 20th century, the voice became potential material for the artwork. A repeating aspect of this exploration of the voice is a tradition of inquiry into and interrogation of the nature of language and its structure. These inquiries are wide-ranging, from the approach to the word within the writings of artists such as Mallarmé, Pound and Cummings, to the assault on typographical representation in 20th century art, notably Dada, Futurism and Lettrism, The use of language and the voice as material, from Kurt Schwitters to Janet Cardiff, Bruce Nauman to Susan Phillips, and to the use of recording techniques to interrogate an abstract language, including the practitioners of musique concrète and sound poetry. These assaults upon the communicative core at the heart of text are located within a wider incremental movement in the arts towards a radical shift in representation, a shift which takes as its focus the erosion of the art object to the point of disappearance. Language played a key role in this reductive shift, in tandem with its silent partner, the dissolving voice. The growing perception of language as an ossified mode of discourse, which developed within the arts during the modernist period, encouraged the evolution of a rebellion located on the page and in the larynx. This movement shifted emphasis from text as carrier of meaning to text as image, as symbol. Dada collage exemplified this tendency, redirecting the focus of language away from its communicative purpose into the realm of image, of shape. And the practice of language as ordering system and conveyor of communicative meaning is thus undermined, leaving it adrift in an open field of the visual. Simultaneously, the larynx reeled, collapsed, dissolved in the declamatory clangor of the versa and verta of the Dada poets and the zangtum-tum intonations of Marinetti and the Futurists. This nihilistic abrasion of the voice reduced the poetic transcription to a parade of syllables and sound events, anticipating the aspiration towards the condition of glossolalia in the automatic writing of the surrealists, and on further to the patricidal birth of the lettrists, and the eventual foregrounding of the materiality of language itself in the work of the sound poets. This interlacing network of approaches to the materiality of language elicits responsive echoes from successive attempts at radically transforming the potential of the voice. In William Burroughs' 1960s experiments with tape recorders, the voice is fragmented, cut up into phenomic gestures, which tend towards the total eradication of language as meaning, and in doing so, attempt to create a potential space for dissent. This physical use and handling of sound, of the voice, creates a radical disjuncture between the real and the constructed, which is a shared strategy in much of the oppositional art of the 20th century. For example, Martha Rosler's Vietnam War collages, which bring death into the ideal design home, and Chris Marker's film Letter from Siberia, 1961, where the same images are replayed 3 times with 3 contrasting soundtracks, making explicit how a position can be adopted and enforced as real through the use of the voice. So the abraded voice, mutated, transformed, initially disrupts the chain of the language structure through its own unintelligibility. Radical transformation of the voice creates this form of cut-up through the presentation of a gap between its own presentation, that is language, and intelligibility, meaning. The breakdown of the transmission of linguistic meaning, which this entails, creates a rupture. It's through the gap in meaning that we may have the opportunity to see the reality of the situation and, as in Burroughs' view, then be able to restructure that meaning. The voice merging with the sound field and losing its characteristics becomes a means of rejection and of uprising, just as the sound rises upwards from the body into the reed of the larynx. So, just as the dense rectangular blocks of black ink in Man Ray's poem Optique 1924 obliterate the intelligibility of the text and create a negative space, this abraded, mutated, transformed, transfigured voice refuses. What we have left is an emptiness, a black hole that opens up when language dissolves and vanishes. So my use of the voice, my own voice and those of others, is exploratory in form and both artistic and political in intent. It's artistic in that the voice becomes material for the creative work, allowing for the development of a nexus of illusions, reference, and expression political in that the voice itself may be utilised in a project to delimit the restrictions imposed on the individual by culture and society through an erasure of one of the means by which those restrictions are imposed, that is, through language. I am aware that this usage may contain within itself its own refutation. The question remains, is it possible to imagine communication without language in some form? Even an impetus towards silence remains within the scope of language. Wittgenstein observed that silence forms an element in a dialogue and therefore is a form of speech. We're aware of a multitude of forms of non-verbal communication, but how effective can they be? Do they provide us with what we require? Or do we always have to have recourse to language? Despite this awareness of potential critiques, I believe that it's in these actions, in this use of the voice, and the desire to experiment, to explore, to probe, that there remains a future of possibility. And I'll end on a short statement that would help to sum this up. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. Would you mind taking some questions from the audience? Is there any? Please raise your hand if you wonder about anything. But while you're thinking, can I ask my question? I'm just wondering about if you could talk a bit more about the state of the black hole when the language, when the meaning built with language means are suppressed. And when I was wondering what is happening with a phenomenon of representation. Does voice still has this function? And does it still point of some things that are not here but representing something absent? Or does it get completely different nature of presence and materiality? What happens, then?
I think when I think of the metaphor of the black hole, I think of a rejection of the associations with the voice that are given to me from the culture in which I develop. So the black hole for me is a point of stasis where language, through the voice, stops to have its prescribed meaning. That doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't have any meaning and it doesn't do anything. It doesn't, but what it definitely doesn't do is what it's supposed to do by other people's standards. For me, at that point, points of stasis are points of development, because at that point, perspectives are open and there's potential to move everywhere. When I perform, I use the voice effectively as a form of material, in that my voice is not necessarily intended to be conveying anything linguistically. It's becoming material to move around in time and space. So, for instance, when I gave a performance here at the opening of the exhibition, and sometimes people say to me, when you were what seemed to be shouting, we couldn't really hear what you were doing. That's because what I'm doing at that point is I'm sending my voice through units to mutate. It's triggering other things. It's not necessarily intended to have any representation other than as a form, a conduit for other sound. So it, to me, enters into the black hole because it negates its cultural requirements. But at the same time, it opens into a space of freedom. And at that point, for me, I believe that it's possible rather to have linear progression operating on the horizontal. I believe it's possible to move vertically in time and to shift time, and then also to shift the nature of reality. I understand it's quite a magical concept. I have written a lot about this in a much larger extension of this text, but it's essentially fetishistic by its nature in terms of it takes the voice as the fetish. But that form of magical thinking underpins a lot of the things I'm interested in, such as William Burroughs' cut-ups.
Is it connected to the way the meaning is built with language means or with no language means, or like how does it turn this access to the vertical?
For me, it's rather hard to explain, I suppose.
As always with magic.
Yeah. Time itself is viewed in the West as moving in linear structures. And actually, Rashida spoke about this in her piece at the opening of the exhibition, because I think perhaps, if I've understood it correctly, part of the project which she is involved in is to look at other ways of utilising time itself. I do a similar thing in that I think that at the point when the voice stops having endpoints, in that theoretically, once it becomes a chain inside my recording apparatus, it exists forever in a linear form. At that point, I can start to explore it in different directions on the vertical. And in doing so, I'm negating that limiting aspect of the linear motion of time.
Thank you very much. Are there any more questions? Okay, then thank you, Nicholas, and thank you everybody for coming. Please go and see the exhibition, those of you who haven't seen it yet, and also please remember that there is another live event will take place in connection with the exhibition, and it's a concert by Attila, 15th of September, 21 o'clock, free entrance. Hope to see you all there.